Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thanks very much for coming out to hear our talk. This is one of the first times that we've presented this new political social policy foundation or think tank, which we're founding, called the Institute for Cultural Evolution. And we're going to talk for about 50 minutes, and then we're going to have plenty of time for questions, comments, objections, challenges. I mean, this is politics, so it's no need to be polite, just civil. Yeah. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the background of how we came to found this foundation, where we're going with it, what the underlying principles or premises behind why we're founding this organization, and what kind of approach we think what kind of impact we think we can make. Then we're going to talk a little bit about our campaign plans. We have one campaign for climate change, and another campaign that's in the works now for reducing political polarization, which are two big issues, both of which are highly impacted by the underlying culture war, which is certainly where we're focusing, is on the identity issues or the political issues. So I'm Steve McIntosh. This is Carter Phipps. We've been friends and colleagues for many years. We're both authors and thought leaders in this emerging integral or evolutionary movement. I'm the author of the recent book, Evolution's Purpose, and Carter's author of the recent book, Evolutionaries. And even though most of our work has been focused on spiritual or philosophical issues, we've known for many years that this enlarged, emerging understanding of the evolution of consciousness and culture has significant impact in the political arena. But exactly how to apply it to politics has always been, something that we've been thinking about and talking about and staying up late worrying about. I think that one of the things that comes to most people as they develop a progressive worldview, and especially at the integral level of development, you begin to feel a deep personal sense of responsibility to try to make the world a better place. And not in superficial ways, but in ways that really achieve results. And we've been working on this Institute for Cultural Evolution for over a year now, and we're just beginning to go public with it now, and we're really excited about the response we're getting and about the new potentials that this is bringing. We're pioneering a new frontier of political activism. Because once we understand how consciousness evolves, how the culture moves with consciousness, this is a very exciting way that we believe we can impact issues like climate change that seem stuck or where we've gone backwards as a society.
Just to repeat a little bit of what Steve said, it's just we've been at least 10 years thinking about these ideas, considering them, writing about them. As some of you know, I was the editor of a magazine called Enlighten Next, or What is Enlightenment, and that was a magazine that featured many of these ideas and talked about some of these theories and talks about the way they might apply. And Steve and I met through our collaboration on the magazine. And as soon as we met, we both had this passion for the political sphere, and we would, as he said, we would stay up late talking about it. We would have long conversations over the phone and just be, deep into, this is so relevant. These ideas have so much application, they're so significant, and yet exactly how to apply them, how to pursue them, how they apply to specific issues, it took a while to get to the point in the circumstances in our life where we could start to say, we're both in transition, we're both changing what we're doing in terms of our life and career. Let's talk about how we could actually turn this into really making an impact, because we both believe that we could. And so over the last year and a half, we've had the opportunity to do that. And so we've really spent like a year talking about and writing and really doing a lot of research to prepare for at least the beginning launch of this institute. And we just started a couple of months ago. We just went live on our website and published the initial papers. And it's been so gratifying because we've gotten so much response over the last 2 months. Every day we get people writing to us, interested, wanting to volunteer. We barely have anything started yet. Already people want to volunteer. It's been very gratifying to see that kind of response. And one of the most interesting responses we got was we were invited to speak at Esalen and present at Esalen recently. And for those of you who don't know, Esalen's an interesting mix. On one hand, they have all their programs and activities in one part of what Esalen is. And another part, they have sort of their own kind of think tank. It's called the Center for Theory and Research, and they have small gatherings of very high-level people that come to that kind of think tank and meet and collaborate and talk together. And one of those gatherings they have every year is called the Conscious Capitalism Gathering. And they have CEOs who are interested in the idea of conscious capitalism. They have CEOs from all around the country and even internationally come, and about 20 people come and collaborate and talk about how to transform business and transform capitalism. And Steve and I were invited to present the Institute to that group of people, which included some really significant people in our culture today. Individuals like John Mackey, the Whole Foods CEO. And it turned out he's actually been a fan of our work for a number of years and was very excited about the Institute and has offered to be on our board. And so, we made some great connections, and it felt like it was a great kind of launching point in which we can begin to really, put these ideas out there in the cultures.
So about a year ago, Carter and I joined forces with Elizabeth Bould, who is also a former editor of Enlighten Next magazine, an expert on women's development, and Professor Michael Zimmerman, who's a professor of philosophy here at the University of Colorado. He's on his sabbatical in New Orleans at the moment, or he'd be here, but he has been a big pioneer in integral theory as well as us. And so on our website, we have a variety of documents. We have a business plan for the startup nonprofit that includes budgets and how we're going to raise the money and what we're going to spend it on, the tactics of how we're going to actually achieve cultural evolution, which we'll get into here in a minute, as well as the campaign plan for climate change amelioration, which we started working on in December of 2011, and which has a lot of research. It reaches all the way down to the ground in terms of specific media vehicles and specific talking points and detailed strategies about how we're going to focus on changing people's view on climate change. And we also have, about 3 months old, a beginning plan for ameliorating the gridlock that is affecting our American political system, and which is a huge problem, which is an identity issue, a culture war issue. And so this is sort of what we're going to talk about tonight, primarily the climate plan and the polarization plan. But first, we want to talk about the key insight of this integral perspective, and that is that human consciousness evolves. And while that may seem obvious, in some ways, in other ways, our society hasn't really digested this extremely important point. If we think about animals, in order for an animal to evolve its consciousness, for an animal to get smarter or more aware, it has to evolve its biology, right? That is, the brain and the consciousness sort of evolve in lockstep. And one of the amazing things about humans is that we've demonstrated our ability to evolve our consciousness in ways that are partially independent of our biology. Whatever evolution the brain may have gone through in the last 40,000 years, this by itself can't explain the significant evolution in human consciousness that's occurred in this same period. But this is not necessarily metaphysical or mysterious. Consciousness evolves as human culture evolves. Humans have, because of their freedom, because of their self-awareness, we're able to see problems in ways that our animals' cousins cannot. And as soon as we solve one set of problems or take care of one set of needs, we awaken to a new set of needs. So human needs can never be satisfied. And it's not because we're necessarily greedy, it's because we have the freedom to envision a new and better way. And this is what allows us to evolve our culture and consciousness in ways that are unprecedented here on Earth. And for the last 40,000 years, humans have been working to improve their conditions, right? In other words, cultural evolution is not the same thing as biological evolution. It can't be conflated with biological evolution. Biological evolution occurs sort of inexorably through random mutations and then environmental selection. But human consciousness and culture only evolve when humans try to make the world a better place. And so humans have been trying to improve their conditions for many, many generations. But one of the most dramatic ways that humans have improved their conditions in history is by improving their definition of improvement itself. Just like all forms of evolution, where we continue to see these emergence of more complex forms of organization, something more keeps coming from something less in the grand history of evolution. It's 13.8 billion years old. And we can see this same developmental complexifying awareness-building process going on in human history, where new emergences of new worldviews that are framing reality in a new way, defining a new set of problems and a new set of solutions. And though these worldviews have been emerging, for thousands of years, the most dramatic worldview, the one that's created more cultural evolution than any worldview before or since, has been the worldview we define as modernism. Carter will tell you a little bit about that more in a second. But modernism's problems are really demanding that further evolution is needed. The way forward, the way to solve the problems of global warming and unregulated globalization and gross wealth inequality and nuclear proliferation, almost any problem we can identify can be understood at least partially as a problem of consciousness. So, except for maybe a volcano exploding, if we could learn a way, if we could discover and perfect a way of non-coercively evolving consciousness, of persuading people into more enlarged viewpoints, an expanded idea of what's in their self-interest, then we'd have a tremendous way of solving all kinds of problems that are seemingly intractable. So the evolution of consciousness has real potential. And if we recognize the evolution of consciousness as something more that keeps coming from something less, we can begin to understand that this is not just a seamless continuum of growth, that there's actually a structure, indeed a structure that exhibits sort of a dialectical pattern of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And whether we identify this pattern as discrete stages or as a continuous flow, maybe like a meandering river across a floodplain, there's definitely tension in the system, tension in the structure. And this goes back to my point about improvement. It's a little bit like the evolution of consciousness as culture, a little bit like a sailboat, right? A sailboat can't sail directly into the wind. It has to advance obliquely, tacking back and forth. And that's a little bit, it's kind of an analogy of how consciousness and culture evolve. Because what counts as improvement, what we can do to make things better, are defined by the problems of the society that we live in. So every time we follow an opening for cultural evolution, we're sort of moving away from what's wrong. And this inevitably makes that cultural evolutionary movement, although it's progressive, it means that it in some ways it has latent pathologies of its own because it's been trying to improve things relative to what was already wrong. So that there's only so far you can go in improvement before you have to tack back and improve in the other direction to sort of keep the heading toward perfection, if you will. And this creates these structures in history, which is a key part of our understanding that impacts our political analysis from top to bottom.
Great. So how does that look? What does that look like when Steve talks about structures in history? Well, without going into great detail about world history and the last 10,000 years of civilization, let's talk for a moment about history and the structures in history as it's expressed in the American political electorate today. So today, as we can see here, there are three essential worldviews. And look, there's a lot of ways to divide this up. These are generalizations, but we believe they're significant generalizations and important generalizations. And these generalizations allow us to make very interesting distinctions about how to respond to political issues and social issues today. So today, as we can see here, the American, our nation is roughly divided up into three worldviews. A traditional worldview that we'll call it traditional worldview, which is about 30% of the population, a modernist worldview, which is roughly around 50% of the population, and a postmodern worldview, which is roughly around 20% of the population. So what does that mean? So let's start with traditional and modernist. That's the two worldviews most people recognize. When Thomas Friedman in the 1990s wrote the book that made every bestseller list, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, those are the two worldviews he was talking about, right? He said people are kind of dividing up along two lines globally. Some people want the Lexus, the modernists. They want capitalism. They want a modern economy. And some people want the olive tree. They're reaching back to tradition. Those are more the traditionalists. They're reaching back to what's often a religious worldview. And of course, we see that in our country too. This is what a lot of people recognize when they talk about worldviews active in American politics. This traditional worldview, this often religious, socially conservative worldview, the Jerry Falwells, the Pat Robertsons, this traditional worldview that we've all come to know and love, and the modernist worldview. Now, the modernist worldview is what we think of as evolving in the Western Enlightenment. It's the worldview that brought us capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, democracy, secular humanism, the science, that worldview, the rational age, the secular age. That's the modernist worldview that has, as Steve said, probably improved human conditions in the last 200 or 300 years more than any worldview that has emerged before or since. It's been incredibly effective at improving human conditions, and it evolved in response to many of the problems of the traditional worldview, that mythocentric, religious, superstitious, otherworldly kind of focus, and it evolved in response to that and solved a lot of the problems that worldview couldn't address, and evolved the human condition in tremendously important ways. But one of the characteristics of these worldviews is they all make significant progress, and then they all have pathologies that come as a result. So that dynamic between progress, positive progress, and pathology is very important to remember as we talk about the way culture evolves. So they make progress, but then they have their own pathologies, and then often a new worldview evolves to address those pathologies. So when we think of an American political electorate, we often think of traditional and modernist. But what most political commentators don't realize is that in the last, let's go back one.
Okay, sorry.
Just for a moment, what most political commentators don't realize yet is that we have a new worldview that's crept up in the last 30 years. And people haven't really processed this truth yet. And when you watch CNN, when you watch MSNBC, when you watch Fox News, and they talk about politics, they'll talk about, often you'll catch references to kind of the modernist and traditional, but they haven't realized that this cultural creative, postmodern worldview that evolved in the initially burst onto the scene in the late 1960s. It really goes back to the 18th century probably. But it burst onto the scene in the late 1960s, and it's been having an impact on the American political electorate ever since. And it roughly today makes up about 20% of the population. And the whole environmental movement, as we know it today, really came of age. It really was born in the postmodern worldview. To a large extent, environmentalism is almost seen as kind of part of that cultural, creative, postmodern worldview. If you say someone's an environmentalist, you're almost saying they're a member of that worldview. Now, what makes this so important is because the dynamic relationship between each of this worldview, how one evolves in relationship to the other in the course of history, in our political system, this postmodern worldview has created this threesome, this dynamic, this systemic dynamic between these three worldviews. And understanding that dynamic is critical to making any kind of political progress. And because so many people don't really appreciate the significance of this emerging worldview, they don't kind of understand the dynamics at work in our culture. And so part of our efforts are to evolve the capacity, to evolve postmodernism. A big part of our plan is to evolve postmodernism so it can have an appropriate impact. Because when postmodernism came on the scene, the two worldviews before it got defensive and reactionary in many ways. They've got defensive and reactionary over the last couple decades. And so understanding those dynamics at work, and the culture wars are born out of those dynamics. And so only through understanding those dynamics can we have the impact that we want to have. And just one final point to make, if you look at the American political spectrum as it's spread out along the demographic here, you see the traditional demographic on the right, and then the modernist demographic in the middle, split between the more conservative libertarian modernist and the more liberal modernist, and then the postmodern demographic on the end. And the opportunity kind of the heart of the Institute for Cultural Evolution is to build a new kind of political will between that postmodern demographic on the end and the modernist demographic. If you can build a new political will between those camps, you can make all kinds of progress in all kinds of issues. But right now, those camps are in a culture war that's preventing that. And the dynamics of that culture war is what we're trying to address.
Good. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our climate plan to get specific. The context is that in the first part of the 2000s, climate change and political will, both the political will to care about it and vote in favor of it, and the economic demand to demand products like electric cars or wind power for your power, all those things were growing, and there was a large consensus within the American body politic that climate change was something that we all had to take responsibility for. But then a variety of things occurred. We had a recession, and we had a well-funded campaign by Tea Party and oil company-funded think tanks to call into question the science and to generally attack the forms of consensus which were building in favor of action on climate change. And as a result, since 2007, the poll numbers dropped about 20 points in favor of ameliorative action on climate change. And this is, according to pollsters, this is one of the most dramatic drops in support among the political opinion.
Yeah, let's appreciate that from the poll, 20 points in like 5 years. That's how much of an impact something has had, either these think tanks or something else, but that's a tremendous amount of impact. And that's in the midst of millions of dollars being poured into foundations to support the issue of climate change, and the poll numbers go down 20 points. So that's what we're dealing with.
Right. Now, the polls have come back somewhat. And of course, we're happy to see Obama mention climate change relatively prominently in his inaugural in January, but it's still not really on the political table. It certainly wasn't talked about during last year's election, and there's certainly the consensus that gives both our political leaders and our business leaders the permission they need to make the investments and the sacrifice in order to deal with this problem, or at least begin to ameliorate it in effective ways. That political support and that economic support doesn't yet exist. And so our analysis reveals an important reason why. And that is that even though Friedman, who we mentioned before, has been arguing for years that green should be the new red, white, and blue, right? That climate change isn't some, fringe issue. It's not necessarily a leftist issue or progressive issue. It's an issue that impacts everyone and that everyone should care about, and it shouldn't be a political football. It should be something that the entire country can be patriotic about. But despite commentators like Friedman and many others arguing in favor of the general desirability of caring for the environment, it's still a political football and the culture war. But this is, in a sense, understandable. In other words, we talk about the postmodern worldview, and that's a defined term, of course. We're not talking about an art movement. We're talking about a significant demographic of American society, which we also see in other parts of the developed world. And one of the major evolutionary achievements of this postmodern worldview has been care for the environment. Right? We see the modern environmental movement really be born with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in the 60s. But then in 1970, when Earth Day was created, it was counterculturalists who were behind Earth Day. And indeed, in 1970, in the midterm election, 9 congressmen lost their seats because they weren't in favor of the environment. And in the face of that groundswell of environmental care, it got the political attention of the establishment. For example, in the early 70s, we saw Nixon leading the charge to create the Environmental Protection Organization. We saw the passage of the Endangered Species Act and many other forms of landmark legislation to protect the environment. But really, since the early 70s, most of the environmental movement's political focus has been on maintaining those gains. There hasn't been any significant environmental legislation passed since then. And that's because since then, the culture has become differentiated. That is, although the hippies and the counterculture were certainly sort of shunned by the establishment, as the hippie movement became assimilated in a larger progressive culture, and it became not just a youth movement, but a significant demographic, we saw postmodernism emerge out of and become separated from the establishment, from the mainstream kind of consensus of traditionalism and modernism. And that resulted in traditionalism pulling away too. So as one side began to move in the other, that made the other side, the more historically earlier side, dig in their heels. And we saw a reaction with the rise of the religious right and the election of Reagan. And throughout the entire 1980s, there was the progressive side lost a lot of its political power. So now we see the situation where we have these 3 major worldviews, and this is what's causing the polarization. And this is because postmodernism, among its variety of important achievements in culture, the environmental movement is probably its most significant. But because values cohere in sets, because the environmentalism is a perspective, although it's adopted by people across the spectrum, for many in the American mainstream, environmentalism will always have a postmodern flavor. And that's why we want to improve. Our campaign is focusing primarily on the environmental movement and on postmodernism to show them how they're in this position, this larger cultural historical movement from thesis to antithesis. And that's evolutionarily appropriate to push off against the problems of modernism. But the antithesis means that many, when they champion concern for the environment, are unconsciously threatening the very identities and the core values of modernists and traditionalists who resist environmentalism not so much for care for the planet, but because they feel that if the environmentalists were to be given political power, that they would undermine the foundations of much of the achievements of our society.
It's such a critical point, this, and I just want to kind of, dig into it a little bit more because, imagine you're a corporate CEO, right? You're a modernist. You're a believer in science. You kind of identify with that worldview, that rational scientific worldview. In a sense of progress and the achievements of capitalism and all the positives, right? And you see the climate change. Well, in a certain way, the science is pretty straightforward. It's becoming more and more straightforward. That person should be potentially very concerned about this issue and very interested in how to address it. But if they see an environmentalist that's responding to this issue, and they're responding, remember we talked about progress and pathology, right? They're responding not just to the healthy aspects of a worldview, not just to the pathological aspects of a worldview. If they're saying not just, I support the healthy aspects of the modernist worldview, but it's causing these problems and we really need to address these pathologies. If that's what they're saying, it's one thing, but that's often not what's being said. What's being said is this underlying feeling that modernism itself is bad, that it's the problem. That capitalism is the problem. Naomi Klein in the recent Nation article, she said, environmentalists should be clear about their real agenda, which is to get rid of capitalism altogether. See, that's not just responding to the pathology. That's responding to the progress and the pathology, and then you get in this culture war. Because then that corporate CEO, whatever, he starts to feel like this person doesn't just want to address the environment, they want to undermine the foundations of my whole identity. They want to undermine the foundations of this whole worldview, and therefore I'm not going to believe in that because that's a little too far for me and that's a little too extreme. So instead of building political bridges, you've alienated the very people, those modernists, who you have to build political bridges with. And so that dynamic is so critical in how we understand what's going on right now.
There are a variety of ways that we can respond to climate change, of course. Increased renewables, investment in new breakthrough technologies, adaptation, maybe even some carbon sequestering and some unconventional approaches. But our think tank's not taking a techno-economic position on exactly what combination of ameliorative actions are most appropriate. Whatever combination turns out to be the right mix, none of these solutions can become implemented until there's the political will and the economic demand, until people care more and are threatened less. And that's what we're focusing on. So the measurable goals of our campaign plan, everything we do is going to have to be carefully measured. And there's been quite a lot of think tank technology to develop to measure political progress around issues that are sometimes difficult to measure, like political will. Our first measurable goal, is to bring the poll numbers that favor action on climate change back to above 2006 levels. There's a website that consolidates polls, the Pew poll, the Gallup poll. These polls are taken every year. So we'll be able to measure whether or not we're making an impact by this straightforward poll number. And not only will we be able to measure, but our political leaders and our business leaders will be able to measure that as well. We also are going to focus first on helping postmodernists, helping environmentalists understand that when they have a strong anti-modernist agenda, when they vilify consumerism and capitalism, the very demographic segments, the liberal modernists, who would otherwise be on their side, and indeed were on their side before the poll numbers dropped, that these people need to be brought on board in ways that have to decrease the sort of the radical anti-modernist agenda of the postmodern worldview. So we will measure whether our media vehicles, right, we'll have a whole series of our campaign plan includes a provision for of course, blogs, articles, viral videos, longer articles, longer videos. Any way that you can communicate on the internet, we'll be trying and communicating and carefully measuring what impacts the discourse. The postmodern demographic is a little easier to reach than the mainstream. Of course, Washington has a large industry of think tanks and social policy organizations that are trying to influence political opinion in the mainstream. We certainly want to make strategic alliances with many of those progressive organizations. But our focus is going to be on this countercultural demographic because it's easier to reach, and perhaps most importantly, because the theory itself, integral theory, tells us that opportunities for evolution exist where people have a problem they can't solve. And the environmentalists, some of them are just doubling down, right? More scolding, more doomsaying, more vilifying modernism. But others are beginning to realize that approach, although, we agree that the doomsaying and scolding is appropriate, but if it's not achieving political action, and indeed if it's actually reversing your political prospects, then that's a good time to say, what can we do differently? How can we change our strategy? And so we want to message in a variety of ways, not just using various media vehicles, but also using a consortium of PR professionals who the think tank will hire to get the message out. So, for example, if you'd written a book and you had a $200,000 PR budget for your book, you definitely get the attention of the marketplace of ideas. And this is part of the strategy, is not to just be some voice crying in the wilderness. We do want to make a splash, and we do want to use the media in ways that we've learned from being both magazines, business leaders. So we want to evolve the discourse in the environmental movement and the counterculture to help them appreciate that it's time for them themselves to move from the antithesis to the synthesis. And we want to describe what that synthesis looks like.
It's worth just adding to that point because there's actually a great deal of self-reflection going on in the environmental movement right now around because they're wondering why we're not having the impact, why aren't people listening to the science, why, and it's making them reflect a lot on value systems and worldviews. It's kind of a hot topic right now in the environmental movement. You see a lot of papers, thinking about this and reflecting on this and pulling from different psychological approaches and trying to understand why the message is not getting through. But what's not being appreciated and not being fully incorporated is the evolutionary dynamics at work between these worldviews. Because that way in which postmodernism and modernism are in that evolutionary tension and dynamic, that is not being appreciated. That's not being understood, and that's such a critical piece to having an impact.
So once we've had a measurable impact within the environmental movement, then the second prong of the climate strategy goes into effect, which is trying to improve perceptions of environmental action, climate change action within the mainstream, with sound bites such as the changing face of the environmental movement. And then, of course, our fourth goal there is to make concern for the environment or energy independence among the top 3 platform issues from the Democratic Party and among the top 5 platform issues for the Republican Party. And we know that's possible because we've seen it, we saw it back before the polarization froze things into place. So to sum up our overall strategy on the climate plan, we want to evolve postmodernism so that it can more effectively do its job of evolving and moderating the larger mainstream culture of modernism itself. So we can talk more about the climate plan and get into the details as we get to the questions, but we want to just cover the polarization plan for another 10 minutes, and then we'll get to the questions.
Okay, great. So the polarization plan is a little less developed than the climate plan. It still needs some further work and development and research, but we'll just give you the overview. And the polarization plan is based on the idea that there's this. This is a huge issue right now. Everyone you talk to, you mention this on the street corner, and people say, "Oh yeah, this is a huge issue," because people are very concerned because it doesn't seem like anything can get through because there's such a polarized situation in our political electorate and in D.C. And even where issues where there's 60%, 70% support among the general electorate, you can't get anything done, And so this is an area of great concern. And there's obviously some structural issues in our political system that may need to be addressed and responded to, but there's also this underlying clash of worldviews that is so critical to address. And how do you begin to kind of apply some, ameliorate, just like in climate change, and take some of that tension to drain the swamp, the kind of poisonous swamp that exists around this clash of worldviews? How do you begin to do that? So in the climate change campaign, we were focusing on postmodernism's relationship to modernism. But in the polarization campaign, we're looking at all of these four different worldviews, four different positions that we talked about, 3 different worldviews, 4 different positions.
Do you want to go to that slide?
Yeah, maybe we should.
Okay.
But this is good.
Okay, the campaign context. Okay.
So part of the context is that, some people have noted that polarization works to the more conservative element's advantage because they want less government. They kind of want they don't mind if government is dysfunctional, and so in some respects, it's on the liberals. The burden is on the liberals and progressives to do what they can to reach across the aisle, to reach across the political spectrum, to help this whole situation evolve. In some respects, it's on the more evolved party who can see some of these dynamics, see some of these culture clashes, to respond and to help this situation move forward. There's this idea in Washington that the center is where we need to go to, that moderate center, that sweet spot of American politics. If we can just go to the moderate center, everything would work out. If you read Thomas Friedman, and I like Thomas Friedman in many different ways, but he loves this idea, there's these 2 extremes. And if we could just go to that sweet modernist center, it would all work. And while there's certainly value in that idea at times, it bypasses an important evolutionary fact that we're not all in the center. We're not all modernist. We have 3 worldviews active. We have multiple positions active. And unless we acknowledge that and begin to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of all of these different positions along our political spectrum, we're not going to be able to build that political will. We're not going to be able to reduce that polarization in the same way. I mean, if you think about, if you're always going for the center, and if you're on the left or right, what does it behoove you to do? The center's here. It behooves you to take a more extreme position here because, the center moves toward you. The more extreme position you take, the more the center moves toward you. So this myth of a certain centrism or radical centrism is one of the things we have to break. There's certainly value in it, but when we begin to see the dynamics between these three different worldviews, it begins to make us think differently about polarization.
So our plan is not to glue the pieces back together. We're not naively hoping to achieve the liberal consensus that we had in the early 70s. What the evolutionary theory that we're working with tells us is that the way to move from this current state of differentiation to a higher state of integration. In other words, I'm not sure whether I made this point, this is the way evolution works. That the polarization that we're experiencing is not necessarily the result of the decay of our society. It's as a result of cultural evolution that things have become polarized. But this is the way evolution works. First, there's differentiation, and that allows for a higher level of integration. So it's important to make this distinction between just trying to come back to a center which we've evolved past and stake out a position of synthesis. We're calling it the synthesis platform. And it's not a new political party, but it's a way of defining issues that suggest how these otherwise very different political positions can be better integrated and harmonized without just trying to kind of make a mush in the middle. And what the theory tells us is that the way an evolutionary ecosystem works, this is what we're dealing with, this is sort of an internal cultural ecosystem of consciousness that forms these cultural structures that we're looking at. And when we look at a biological evolution, we can see the way it works is that when a level achieves its evolutionary success, the way that emergence occurs, the way that something more comes from something less and builds on the evolution that came before, is it takes up and uses the important accomplishments of the earlier level. And so if we look at this in history, we can see, that at one time, before the emergence of modernism, before the Enlightenment, right? The majority of the world were in this worldview of which we now understand as the traditional religious worldview. And there were many important accomplishments that this worldview achieved that we actually need to use. Even though we've transcended this worldview, we haven't transcended the need for fair play, for decency, for honesty, for respect for rightful authority. These are all evolutionary achievements of the traditional worldview. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson understood that functional democracy could not exist if there wasn't this degree of what he called public virtue. And public virtue, although every worldview has their own version of it, that sense of fair play that's necessary for a functional modernism is an evolutionary ongoing achievement of traditionalism. And we want to be able to tease apart, as Carter said, the important evolutionary achievements that we need for a functional higher level society from the traditional worldview and carry those forward into this synthesis platform. Likewise, the fiscally conservative modernists, the libertarians, they have important ideas. We don't want to just let them take over the government, but we can't just make a win-lose political system where our win is at their expense. We want to take some of the best, some of the enduring truths that will always be true from that stage of cultural evolution and carry it forward into this synthesis platform. So our paper, our strategy, calls for identifying carefully elements from every one of these worldviews and harmonizing them together in a way that respects and understands the evolutionary achievements of each one. And we plan to do this in a way that's not just some idealistic manifesto. We want to be really politically savvy about this. We want to develop, by careful research and through focus groups, by using political professionals to come up with a synthesis platform that can appeal to a politically significant demographic segment across the spectrum. And while none of these campaigns are going to sort of achieve our goals as a magic bullet or a panacea, we believe that once the culture starts to understand that there is a synthesis that's possible, that there is a position that's not merely fully polarized or unrealistically centrist, then we can carry forward many traditionalists and fiscally conservative modernists into a new political agreement that can achieve real effects. So our strategy here is to, we've mentioned these, you can see it graphically there, the libertarian modernists, the traditionalists, the liberal modernists. We want to try to, the synthesis platform is going to attempt to integrate all these elements of the political spectrum. So our strategy for reducing political polarization is to incorporate the essential truths and bring forward the strengths and policies of libertarians and traditionalists, because it's the liberal modernists and the progressives who it's the more evolved party. If we look at it with a vertical dimension of development, that it's their responsibility to reach out and because the polarization is going to work in favor of the conservatives, so the liberals have to move on it. And this is one way that's not being talked about in the political discourse that they can do that.
It's good to be clear here. It's like, because I think one of the most important, as I hear you speak, I'm struck by the fact that it's not really just, we're not just throwing a bone to, religious conservatives so we can get then what we want. It's appreciating and understanding that there are real issues, as you pointed out, that there's real progress there that needs to be upheld and integrated, and then pathologies that need to be pruned away, and letting the synthesis platform do that, which each of these positions along the political spectrum. And you hear people all the time kind of longing for this, the 1960s and the 50s when people got along and we were able to make all progress on all kinds of issues. You hear them kind of long. There's this kind of whether or not it was ever quite that harmonious, I doubt. But nevertheless, it was different then. But it's different in the way that we can't go back to. We can't go back to some context in which most people were modernist and in which the traditional worldview wasn't so reactionary. The emergence of the postmodern worldview created a completely different dynamic, and so what it takes to overcome polarization is different than everyone compromise and meet in the middle. It's a different world today, and we have to respond to that differently.
So what would that look like? Well, this is why this campaign for political polarization is just in its initial. A significant amount of research is ahead of us, and at this point in the think tank, we're raising money so that we can pull the trigger on these campaigns. But as a preliminary sort of stab at what some of these essential strengths that we don't want to carry forward, we're certainly, when it comes to traditionalists, we're certainly not going to give up our achievements in civil rights or gay rights or reproductive freedom. These are all important things which traditionalists would like to see done away with, and we're not proposing diminishing any of those achievements. But what if we were to understand that maybe there is a place for spirituality in public life, more so than it is? Maybe if this separation of church and state wasn't quite as harsh, and we were able to understand, for example, that some multicultural form of school prayer might not be the worst thing that ever happened to the American state educational system. But that's just one small example of how we would reach out to traditionalists and show them that the essential achievements of their worldview are being respected. Likewise, within libertarianism, we certainly don't want to give up the important social safety nets and all of the important achievements that many libertarians would have us do away with. But maybe there are some areas of the federal government, complex regulatory bureaucracies, like the FDA, for example, that might be managed a little bit more effectively from a libertarian point of view. Again, we may say we don't want any of that if we're progressives. But then we have the political polarization where we have, 48% of the United States who feel alienated by our position. So even though we may have to give up some things to bring over a significant demographic portion of America into a more synthetic position, we will gain in the process the ability to solve all kinds of problems that were currently blocked by the divided electorate that we have. So just quickly, the measurable campaign goals for the polarization plan includes researching and staking out and carefully crafting through research and focus groups a synthesis platform that is designed to achieve consensus and show some fresh perspectives on many of these difficult issues. Now, once we have the plan in place, then, of course, we want to use a consortium of public relations professionals, a whole variety of media vehicles, carefully crafted talking points to secure mainstream media attention for the fact that this is a synthesis platform. And as long as polarization remains such a difficult and trying issue, we believe that we'll be able to get the attention of a significant portion of the media if we have some fresh ideas. Then, of course, just like with climate change, there are a variety of polls that are carefully measuring where this polarization issue is, using different questionnaires, different instruments. But we can track these polls in a consolidated way and be able to measure, in real time, or at least, without too much lag, whether these messages are having an impact in making people think differently about cultural evolution in general and political polarization in particular. And then, of course, while our focus is not on electing specific officials, our focus is not on specific forms of legislation, if the polarization plan is working into breaking the logjam a little bit, we will see more moderates from both sides of the spectrum elected in both the 2014 and the 2016 upcoming elections. And we have a good sense that we'll be able to achieve that.
We're excited about this. So we feel it's a fresh way to look at it. It's not an approach that people are trying. It's not an approach that is on people's radar, It's obviously there's a lot of things out there, and many of them are going to be essential for overcoming any of these issues. But this is an angle that is untried. It's untested, but it has this great promise about it. And and there's just this. It's a new, as Steve likes to say, it's a new form of political activism. We haven't tried this kind of approach before. We haven't addressed culture before and addressed these value systems at this level. And I hope you can see, the way it has the potential to kind of reach across the aisle in a different way, to reach across to these other worldviews and uplift some of these healthier aspects in a way that's going to make them feel a different kind of affirmation and a different kind of willingness to engage. And I hope you see the way in which that very effort has broken down so much and is causing some of the political stagnation we're seeing. So, I think with that...
Yeah. Let me just say before we open it up for audience discussion that we hope that you will surf over to our website, have a closer look at these papers to see the details of how we exactly... we're presenting it at a pretty high level. We're leaving lots of open questions. We'll try to get to some of those as we have the discussion. But in addition to looking at the papers, we ask you to sign up for our email list so you can receive news about all the developments we plan to be making this year and in the time ahead. And if you're interested in supporting the think tank, we are a nonprofit organization, and we're having a little reception tomorrow night at my house. Anybody who's interested in that, just see me afterwards. But at this point, let's talk about it and explain it more thoroughly by getting at your questions or comments. Yes, sir.
Please.
I really like your idea of the synthesis platform of doing the transcend and include.
Yeah.
And certainly incorporating every voice and every ear so that they're coming together. I'm wondering if you've considered, there's three major forms of evolution that I look at. One is physical, biological, you talked about. There's also the consciousness. There's also the evolution of our brain, because our consciousness has to be translated through our brain and through its evolutionary structure before it comes out as action. And that seems like a critical piece to be able to use to be able to transform society or these groups, is really recognizing what's the strengths and the limitations of their evolutionary brain to incorporate these ideas you're trying to bring together.
Well, I mean, I think, obviously we don't get into that element of it in the way we've presented it so far and the way we write about it. And certainly there's a lot of people have done research on polarization and neuroscience and the dynamics of the brain and how that works. And there's a body of research and interesting thinking out there along those lines. And it's worth noting that any of these kinds of responses, any of these kinds of issues, they all have reflections, of course, in our brain, in the capacities that we're using, in the new connections that we're forming, in the ways, all of this evolution of these structures and worldviews are of course all going to be reflected in the way in which we use our human brains, which is of course the correlate of consciousness. So we're talking about kind of the structures of consciousness and how they evolve and how we can address them, but all those have correlates in the human brain, so it's almost another way to look at a very similar issue.
Some of the academic focus at dealing with issues like climate change is focused on neurology and specifically on behavioral science, the science of behavior change, right? There's been research on what they call cultural cognition, where one of the results of the polarization is that people have their own facts, right? There's traditional facts, modernist facts, postmodern facts, and unless the facts are approved by your worldview, they don't seem to get through. So we certainly plan to use this important research to be done on behavior change in the tactics of our campaign. But we don't think that it's just a matter of getting the commercial right. We don't think it's just a matter of appealing to people's self-interest. I mean, while that's worth doing, it's going to take a larger measure of cultural evolution, and that's at the level of values. It's not at the level of kind of the right advertising slogan. It's going to be about getting at the structures of values which create this internal cultural ecosystem we've been talking about. So there's more there, but we only have so much expertise. Yes?
Yeah, I guess, are you familiar with that poll that came out last year by Gallup that showed that fewer Americans than ever believe in the science of evolution? And I'm just wondering what your theory is as to why we're going backwards and how that impacts your work.
Well, it's the same. It's the same thing, really, because it's just a different two worldviews that are clashing there. Because the reason more Americans don't believe in the science of evolution is because the science of evolution, for what we can go into the cultural issues, we don't need to go into the history of it. The science of evolution has become fully identified with a modernist worldview, and in particular with a modernist orientation that is highly critical of a traditional worldview, right? And so, for a traditional consciousness, for a traditional worldview, to believe in the science of evolution is like to believe in something that's denying your right to even be religious or to be religiously oriented. So evolution has become a pawn in that culture war between traditionalism and modernism. It's incredibly unfortunate. It's unnecessary, but evolution has become a pawn in that culture war. So.
Yeah, with the numbers that you had, it seemed like there were just 30% of traditionalists, which doesn't explain the 47%.
Well, inevitably, depending on how they frame that question, they always get different answers. So the percentages kind of move up and down depending on how they frame it and who. There's always some play in between those worldviews. But I was around, I just was on tour with my book, Evolutionaries. It's all about evolution. And again, you'd see, I got some of this response. You see people, they don't want to believe in evolution because they feel like to believe in evolution denies all the qualities, the healthy qualities that they feel are important about their worldview. That there's meaning to life, that there's purpose to life, that there's that they can actually have a religious viewpoint. They think to embrace evolution is to deny all that. So that's why, again, I don't want to get too deep into this issue, but it illustrates how a culture war can obscure an issue so dramatically.
Are you finding that in the postmodernists as well, that some postmodernists are saying,
I don't
to
think
heck
with
with
evolution. I don't
No,
think so.
all
I think
postmodernists believe in
postmodernists-
evolution, pretty much, yeah. But it's important to emphasize around this question that we're not trying to promote our worldview. We're not out there trying to sell or the evolutionary worldview or proclaim integral consciousness. That's sort of in the background. While we have to be transparent about where we're coming from and the books we've written, et cetera, it's more about working with people, working with political factions where they have a problem they can't solve, and saying, look, there's a cultural dimension to this that we can add value here. We have something to contribute. So we don't even need traditionalists to believe in evolution for them to participate in evolution, because it's not about an idea, it's about a political movement and in a much more sort of subterranean way. Yes, sir, in the back.
So I got kind of a three-parter here for you. First, I didn't get a clear definition of what a postmodernist is. All I heard was environmentalism, and maybe I missed it. So maybe you can clear me up there as point one. Point two, I love the comment that you made earlier about non-coercive ways to achieve higher consciousness.
Right.
I'm assuming that you're including governmental coercion in that as well.
Well, it's hard to force people to evolve their consciousness. I mean, the more you force them, the more resistant they become.
But they can force behaviors. So it's coercion of behavior. And then the third thing is I didn't see anything about using market forces to drive this, which I think is if you really look back at history, market forces create a lot of change very fast. I'm wondering if that doesn't have a role in your strategy.
It certainly does. I try to emphasize that by saying that we want to build both political will on the political side and economic demand. The idea being, while we're not entirely convinced that the free market can ameliorate climate change on its own, we believe that certainly government can't do it on its own either, that there's got to be a work between them. And there were times, even though it seems that anything the federal government tries to do nowadays is a ham-handed attempt, that there's very few things they can do well, there have been times in history when the U.S. government was able to achieve significant economic or technological advances. We can point to perhaps the Manhattan Project during World War II, where they developed the atomic bomb, or the space project in the 1960s, where they were on the moon. One of the reasons that government was effective in those situations is that there was, at the time, a tremendous amount of patriotism and social consensus about the value of those projects. And those projects attracted some of the best and the brightest of the society that really got behind them and made them work. So that's why, this idea of patriotism and the idea of reducing polarization, it's sort of a kind of a halo effect. But we do believe that it can make the federal government more effective. Now, we're not advocating that the federal government should undertake this by itself. But we think that if we can achieve this combination of increased economic demand for things like wind power, renewables, for investment in companies that are trying to achieve breakthrough forms of technology, for electric cars, for all the things that are going to help our society move beyond fossil fuels. Even if you're a climate change skeptic, you'll probably admit that peak oil is here and that the geopolitical situation could be improved significantly if we can get the developed world to transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a more sustainable form of energy economy.
So the definition of postmodernism?
Well, it's worth noting, even in what Steve said, that all of that, those public-private partnerships that worked well, to some extent the space race and the Manhattan Project, were all before the emergence of postmodernism. It was before the emergence of this dynamic that we're identifying that's causing this systemic issue around these three worldviews that have emerged. So postmodernism is what we normally think of in a way when we think about the 1960s and what emerged in the 1960s and how that has evolved. These worldviews in their own way keep evolving as they develop, even if some of their essential values remain the same over time. So in the 1960s, you saw this new emergence of this reemergence of a spiritual but not religious sensibility. This new respect to reach down and appreciate earlier cultural forms, indigenous cultures. This appreciation of environmentalism. This recognition that modernism had done a lot of damage to our environmental to the environment, and we needed to respond to that issue. This greater interest in self-development and sensitivity, and this sensitivity to a lot of the women's rights and civil rights, and recognizing that so many of our kind of fellow humans weren't eating from the same table, so to speak. That they needed to be included in the processes that had begun with the Western Enlightenment. So all of those issues kind of emerged in full force with the emergence of the postmodern worldview, and postmodernism championed all of those issues, and it continues to this day. But again, most of the great gains it made were in the 1970s, and since then it's been mostly defending those gains.
Postmodernism is more difficult to identify than modernism or traditionalism because it's the most recent worldview to evolve, to emerge in history, and it's more diffuse. But we can certainly identify its value of course, care for the environment and sustainable forms of commerce, multiculturalism, concern for those who've been marginalized and exploited, a kind of a global internationalism, interest in alternative spirituality, alternative medicine, natural foods. Especially here in Boulder, the culture of postmodernism is very well developed. But no matter, even though there's all these different forms of postmodernism, what binds it together and makes it a coherent worldview with a clear reality frame that makes it as a significant demographic that can be compared to modernism and traditionalism is the agreement of postmodernists about the abundant pathologies of modernism. In other words, just about all postmodernists are anti-modernist in one way or the other, right? Whether it's the destruction of the environment, or capitalism, or unrestrained globalization, or those who are seeking status and material. In other words, it's a critique of whatever modernism's not. Whatever modernism's problems are, that defines the opening for cultural evolution, and many sensitive progressive people have seized that opening by identifying themselves with this countercultural postmodern worldview, which does have economic power. It has outsized economic power, but because it's in this position of antithesis, because so many postmodernists reject our civilization, right, and sort of hope to go back to some pre-modern localized economy, it's become a kind of cork in the bottle. In other words, we want to move the entire spectrum of the American political electorate forward in history. But with postmodernism in a position of sort of rejectionism, that in a sense is a factor that's preventing many modernists and even traditionalists from adopting laudable and sensible goals like concern for the environment. So we want to uncork the bottle. We want to move postmodernism forward so that the entire political spectrum can move forward.
In the back, please.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for letting me ask a question. I wanted to ask about I guess it's more like when you encounter views that are like literally in conflict with each other. Like you brought up the question about evolution. So like the thing that's in conflict is like the claim on reality. Like people did evolve from other biological creatures, or the claim is that the world is 6,000 years old. When the claims are like that polarized, and we understand from, as you guys have explained really well, that these views come out of larger worldviews. But the particular worldviews have like more salient like ideas or points that are like more important to these groups of people. So like when those views are in like utter conflict with each other, in like a political setting or a setting for global warming, like how does one like synthesize something like that, or like move something beyond it when like that's the very thing that's been like entrenching?
Can you give an example of what you mean?
Yeah, like let's say, yeah. So let's say like, I'm sorry, example of what? Maybe I didn't catch the last part.
Example of what of the dynamic you're speaking about.
Yeah, let's say like prayer in school. Like, we'll make it real cut and dry. There should be prayer in school, and there shouldn't be prayer in school. And if you permit prayer in school, but you say it's multicultural, then like the fundamentalist Christians who wanted the prayer for the Christianity reasons now are like, well, like what if someone is next to my child who like prays for like darkness to come over the world? I don't want that kind of prayer in school. But postmodernism is like, that's kind of what we said. You know, like we said everybody can pray. So we have to deal with the prayer of the darkness or whatever, just along with. Do you know what I'm saying? Like
Sure. Well, I can try to address it.
Anyway, postmodernism creates problems that, like, by allowing everybody to come in and play.
Right. That's
Sure.
Right. That are in utter conflict with modernism and
That's
traditionalism.
an innate danger of postmodernism, right? Yes. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. Well, one of the things we're looking at is within these cultural structures, within this internal cultural ecosystem that we've been describing, there are those who are culture warriors, right? Pillars of that particular position. And there's really going to be no changing those people's minds because their identities are completely bound up with that particular structure in history. But not everyone is frozen into place, right? There's large percentages of people in every one of these worldviews who just haven't heard a better argument, who haven't really seen what a synthesis looks like. And so while we don't expect that the sort of the hardcore fundamentalists or the hardcore atheists or any of the orthodox segments of any of these worldviews to change their minds, we do have a reasonable expectation that especially younger people within these groups can be persuaded to see things differently. And so one of the ways that can happen is by being skillful. It's worth mentioning that with respect to any of these issues, getting into them and the answer to a question in 3 minutes, can cause all kinds of misunderstandings or we're sort of talking in very truncated terms. But whether it's school prayer or belief in evolution, trying to show how there is a place for spirituality in public life that doesn't mean Christian hegemony, but it doesn't mean anything goes either. I mean, there are ways to work that out, especially if you have an evolutionary view. Same with the issues about evolution. I mean, I think how you ask the poll, if you're a pollster and you want to create a dramatic poll that everybody pays attention to, you want to create the most anomalous results you can. So you're going to phrase the question in ways that create that polarization. And while there certainly are a significant portion of people in America who are young earth creationists, and that's a big part of their faith, and they're unlikely to be convinced, there are many others for whom evolution is identified with Richard Dawkins, right? And so if you were to show that evolution, for example, itself is a spiritual teaching, that it doesn't invalidate every religious view, and that indeed it's compatible with a wide variety of spiritual perspectives, I think many in the people in that poll would become more sympathetic to the science, because it's not so much the science they're objecting to, it's the philosophy of evolution that's attached to the science, which has become staunchly materialistic.
So we don't have to change everyone in those worldviews. We don't have to undermine every entrenched position. You only have to change a little on the margins to build a completely different kind of political of capacity for political will. So obviously, there's a lot that's not going to move forward. There's a lot that's not going to change, but a little bit of change in some of these demographics can go a long way, and that's what we're aiming for.
Do you take a question here?
Sure.
I guess the question that one of the many that have come to mind is to change consciousness, as we know, is not a small matter. Even postmodernists who may be more changing than some are also very fixed, as we know. I mean, some of us would know, I guess. So I'm wondering if you're thinking about other ways besides addressing just the mind, honestly. Because obviously the mind is important, but it's not, I don't think it's enough. So things, I'm just wondering what you're thinking about in that way.
Yeah.
Like, these are kind of, only some ways, but with music and things that really do get to core, deep places in people in ways that not everyone's going to read a book or, and change.
Right.
They just aren't.
So I'm
Yeah.
I don't want to cut you off. I'm just dying to answer that question.
Yeah.
So I would respond first by understanding how evolution has occurred in history. Right? We now have this beautiful picture of history that scholarship of the 21st century has sort of revealed for us. And we can see in history the emergence of every one of these worldviews, what shifted culture in a big way. And there's really two things going on. There's the push of problematic life conditions that people are trying to solve, and there's the pull of the values of the new emergent worldview, the new truth, new beauty, the new ideals of morality that always accompany the emergence of a new worldview. So, for example, during the Enlightenment, the problems that people faced was that they were living in feudalism, that they were living in a mythic society, that people were frozen into place in their feudal station. With modernism, there was this birth not just of mental ideas, but of new music, new political positions, democracy. The science of scientific medicine improved the human condition in dramatic ways. So it reaches the head and the heart, and values issues have to do with the will and with identity. And it's by using this sort of values technology, if you will, that we hope to reach beyond just a sort of a good idea or another political soundbite, and really give people the emotional sense that evolution is possible. And then indeed...
so that's the technologies, things like music or whatever, YouTube
Well, the
stuff.
technology is values technology, the communication of values,
sure.
the communication of the beautiful, the true, and the good,
Yeah,
which occurs through all kinds of different vehicles,
Right.
both art and science and, argument and
Sure.
everything else.
And a lot of people are working on these issues in different kinds of ways and working to involve culture and consciousness in different kinds of ways. We're not trying to address all of those at once. But I think it's worth saying that when we talk about the evolution issue, right, people aren't responding to that issue because they're rationally thinking out the question. Right. They're responding viscerally because it fits their values or doesn't, right? They're responding, because there's these underlying tensions that they feel at an almost visceral level. A lot of this stuff is very visceral. It's not really at the level of kind of rationally thinking things out. They just kind of feel their worldview is threatened. And in some ways, they're right and they're wrong. So if you can respond and build these issues in such a way that you're acknowledging those healthy attributes of someone's value system, you're going to get hopefully a response that also goes beyond the mind, also penetrates deeper, and where they say, oh, this, my identity, this fundamental identity I care is being appreciated in some sense, is being recognized. Doesn't mean we agree on everything. Doesn't mean we're not going to have differences. But there's a deeper appreciation because you can appreciate the progress and healthy attributes of that worldview. So you're really almost reaching down into the person and kind of validating them at a deeper level and recognizing the truth of their own identity and perspective while saying, look, there are other issues we have to move beyond. It's not going to work in every person, every case. Obviously there's going to be all kinds of things happening, but in a certain way that it's a technology that's really trying to get below to those kind of visceral value responses and work at that level to release some of those tensions.
I'm just going to take this. Okay, so I have a few questions. I'll try to make it maybe one, but one thought just to put out there is with sustainable technology, obviously the oil and the gas and the coal companies that have a lot of lobbying power. So they obviously don't want to become sustainable. They want to use the resources they use. So I'm just kind of saying that, but
Sure.
That's just sort of a small impediment. But it's not, I think you guys can work around that. But my main question is actually the environmentalists that you want to reach out to. Who do you hope to reach? How do you, like environmentalist groups or students or who? And part of the reason I'm asking is because I'm thinking that I know some environmental organizations are already working in that way where they're helping, like FedEx, I think, they help the Environmental Defense Fund. They help FedEx have, better fuel vehicles. And, so they're going in the direction of helping to make things more sustainable rather than saying society as we know it is bad. So I'm just wondering who you're trying to target, how you're going to go about that.
Sure. I mean, this is a measurable demographic group. And while there are not the same kind of well-identified corporate media channels that exist that reach modernism and the larger mainstream. There's a whole host of blogs. There are environmental activists, a whole variety of NGOs and organizations who we want to go and speak to, who we want to blog on their websites. We certainly might even create a bit of controversy and get attention that way. So, for example, identifying people who are well-meaning but are otherwise undermining the environmental movement, like Naomi Klein, in her article in The Nation saying how environmentalists should be overthrowing capitalism. That doesn't help the environmental movement. And so, using points of, we want to have an article in the Rolling Stone magazine. Anywhere that people are reading Bill McKibben or James Hansen, that's a vehicle where we can say, look, we support what they're trying to do. We're on their side, but we just want to understand that sometimes more scolding and more doomsaying is actually, not solving the problem. And we want to say, while we're not invalidating any of that, we want to add to that. We want to approach this from a values issue as well as a science issue, or as well, in addition to just pointing to the melting ice caps, because all presenting the science again and again and getting more scientists to say they agree. I mean, if you don't believe the science now, there's other issues there's other ways to approach it. So,
and there's a long history in terms of the last 50 years of think tanks in various ways influencing the American electorate in various ways, and they do it through all those methods, and it's like, and you can see there is this marketplace of ideas, there's this kind of collection, and part of how you influence public opinion is you begin to influence that in all kinds of subtle and not so subtle ways. You begin to kind of change the conversations people are having, and I think part of what we have the capacity to do is identify more directly this postmodern segment and really begin to push these kinds of conversations into that segment. So, sometimes in ways that people don't even realize. They read 3 articles about the same subject in the same 3 weeks, and they're like, God, I'm starting to think a little differently about this subject. They have no idea, maybe, that some of those issues are being pushed out and being really pursued in such a direct and targeted way, but it does have an impact, and that's already having an impact on all of us, and we're trying to have this kind of positive impact.
A lot of it's just blocking and tackling in the culture war, how the democracy works. People are persuaded, opinions change, political will moves in one direction or another. We've seen it move dramatically this way. We think we can get it to move back this way somewhat.
Thank you. And I just want to say one more thing, which is that I get the confusion that can happen with climate change and then lumping all of our modern problems in with that, because that's kind of so imminent and serious feeling, because I know I can do that and not.
Right.
So I think that'll be a really cool thing for you guys to try to tease apart is, it's like all the other problems of modernism, maybe you guys aren't trying to tackle right now, and you don't have to, and we don't have to. Like, that's what I got is,
right.
Like
every one of those problems has an evolutionary solution, though.
Exactly, yes. Exactly. But I'm just saying for your sake, as you guys move forward, that I think about these things a lot,
sure, yeah.
But I didn't realize I was lumping them all together into climate change. All the problems of society. It's too stressful. It's too busy. It's too isolating. It's not enough time for all the things that kind of stuff. Well, it's all gets clumped into that. So.
I know you had a question. Yeah, we can take the mic. Thanks.
Yeah, I saw James Hansen when he came here with the Conference on World Affairs, and Bill McKibben when he came through town, and I listened to them, Bill McKibben, and he's done so much, and I'm so appreciative. And on the other hand, I think it's not enough. It's still not enough, So then when you look at that and you say, environmentalists are attacking capitalism, and also Charles Eisenstein and all his stuff about, I see interlocking systems, and the rules of the systems, all these interlocking systems, they're so, almost impenetrable, and they're taking us down, and it just seems so big. So that's my question. So, and also, like, the other thing is, so the money in the system, and the lack of transparency, and the the lying, and the confirmation. First of all, you have confirmation bias in the first place, but then when you have lying on top of that, and you have money behind the system and power, it just seems,
Right.
what?
Well, it's easy to give up hope or to just become cynical or alienated.
Right.
Right? And that's why an evolutionary perspective helps overcome that.
No, that's good. Have you noticed how pessimistic postmodernists are? I was just on a book tour, so I got a really good picture of it. I mean, every night someone would get up and say usually a much more dramatic version of what you said, which is that I'm pessimistic in some form or other, and how the hell are we going to do this? And it's like, and so there's a lot of concern there about that issue, and there's a lot of concern in the postmodern movement. And of course, modernists can tend to be very optimistic. They're the opposite. A lot of modernists are there's a whole incredible optimistic movement right now in modernism, which is, there's a lot of books being read about how things are better than they've ever been. And that we're healthier, we're wealthier than we've ever been, despite all the problems. And so we have to find some way to recognize the strengths of both these issues. That on one hand, we're better than things are in some sense better than they've ever been. That modernism has made a tremendous evolutionary advance. And yet, there are real issues that a lot of postmodernists are seeing that also need to be addressed and also need to be recognized. And so, modernism is still the dominant worldview system. And so without getting rid of it, and without speaking to any of those theorists you just mentioned, there are people out there who, if you listen very closely, it's almost like they want to get rid of the whole thing, and they don't really recognize the nature of the scaffolding on which we rest. The wealth and opportunity and the capacity to have conversations like this depends upon 200 years of modernist evolution. So we need to go forward, not to undermine what's come before. And that distinction is so critical as we address these issues.
So that you think that by including more people and bringing them in, that's going to shift things in a dramatic way.
Well, we're trying to be a little bit more nuanced than that. But just to get to your point about the corporate money and how things are fixed, many postmodernists I know, especially those who are very concerned about how dire climate change is coming on, are in a sense frustrated by our democracy, by the fact that it doesn't seem like our democracy can handle it, right? That we're too polarized to be able to deal with it. There's too much corporate money that's blinding people to these larger issues. And while that's a very serious problem, no doubt, if we can understand that this polarization is the result of cultural evolution and that further cultural evolution is to come, that we're not in a position that's the end of history, that it's a very fluid time in history, and that it can kind of restore our faith in the democracy, that the democracy does have power over the corporations, that all the political money, all the ads you buy, they can influence an election, but the democracy is not completely for sale yet. At least I don't believe so. I think that our democracy can overcome these challenges, and we can even overcome, a global warming planet. But part of it involves understanding that the reason that progressives are so politically impotent, the reason that people are frustrated and alienated and feel like they just need to go off and form another country or something is because of this thesis and antithesis, this frozen situation, and that the impotency of the progressives can be the way forward for them to have a bigger impact, to have their laudable ideas adopted more by the mainstream, is to understand this dialectical thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and begin to discover what a synthesis looks like and what uncorking the bottle, so to speak, can really do. For democratic solutions to these problems.
Some of that, it's beautiful what you're saying, because some of that pessimism, you have to understand, is based on an inaccurate understanding of modernism and an inaccurate understanding of postmodernism and an inaccurate understanding of the evolutionary dynamics between them. And so appreciating them more deeply, it does help you have a different kind of relationship to the potentials. Not that we wipe away the problems. Believe me, we have real issues. They are entrenched, and they are difficult, and in no way should we overlook them. But as we were saying, it does help, because some of that pessimism is based on, at least we would propose, and I would propose, an inaccurate understanding of how evolution has emerged in our culture.
Can we have another question or two? In the back?
Yeah, I got one from the live stream here.
Okay.
So I'm reading off the page. So Mark Bloomfield has a question. How do you deal with those traditionalists that essentially try to bully / shout down anyone that disagrees with them?
Guillotine? I don't know.
I'm just getting off the page.
How do you deal with this traditionalist who bully well, I mean, first of all, with the climate change plan we laid out, what we're really trying to evolve is the relationship between postmodernism and modernism. Many of the traditionalists aren't probably going to get on board with some of those issues and some of those politics, but we don't need to be able to move. They don't need to be able to move forward. I guess the other thing you would say is I don't know exactly who he's referring to or what he's referring to or the dynamics that he's referring to, but again, this is not a one-size-fits-all panacea for all the difficult issues and all the clashes that exist between worldviews. But it's an attempt to make measurable progress not on the entrenched individuals in each worldview. They're going to be there. They're going to respond and do their thing regardless. But it doesn't mean that in the face of all that, in a country of this 300 million people, we can't make measurable, real progress, even given all those voices. And even given that many of those voices won't change. We can still make progress. We can still change a significant amount of people. We can still evolve culture. And that's really the essence.
And it's worth saying that it's not just the traditionalists who have a monopoly on bullying, right? Every one of these worldviews have orthodox or culture warrior people within them who want to invalidate the other side. And it's this kind of cross-cultural invalidation that's one of the particular problems that is emergent in this time of history, again, as the result of cultural evolution. So we don't expect that we'll be able to persuade those who are deeply identified with the conflict, but we do hope to show that there's a new way of seeing. And that is, instead of seeing conflict as just a stuck polarity, you can see conflict really as a portal that shows a way forward to a higher level of development. That these opposing viewpoints are actually systems of development, and that the evolutionary technique is to take the best from both without necessarily canceling each other. And so instead of just being partisans for these various polarities we've been describing, we hope to show how the polarities are pointing to a potentially higher level of progress.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, Tom.
Hey, Carter. Going back to something you mentioned at the beginning, which was climate science and the politicalization of climate science and so forth. The current issue of The Economist has a 4-page section on global warming, and the major gist of it is that the planet is not warming as nearly as fast as all the models, and they have a big graph, and within their lengthy article, they're taking the editorial position that we're still not doing enough and we should, but it's quite a strong and bold statement that, hey, here's the big news, it's not warming as fast as you think. So maybe this is a question about the publishing industry, but something like The Economist, if that's not an accurate picture, how does that come about? Is it that they're short of research staff and they just pick up stuff from these think tanks, or is there really legitimate debate around what they're saying? It's very confusing to me about what's objective and what's biased reporting on climate science.
Well,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Sure. Well, and I have not read that particular article, so to respond to that, I'd have to read the issue itself. But even from watching this debate over the last 5 or 10 years, you can see that at times we seem to be saying that climate change is ahead of the models. It's much worse than we predicted. It's that, and then moments they'll say, no, it's not as bad as we thought. And I've seen it kind of go back and forth between that a number of times over the last, even 5 or 10 years, and sometimes contradictory issues itself. I know Business Week just did a big issue on climate change recently, which was quite a remarkable thing for a modernist magazine, again, to be doing this kind of issue about the concern around climate change. So I do feel that, it sounds like The Economist was pointing out that we need to address the issue, and we need to do something, we need to do more, we need to address it, and it's a real issue. And so the specific, I'm sure we're going to change as we move forward in the next 5 years. I'm sure that issue is going to continue to fluctuate in different ways and in different times. But it feels like the issue itself still needs to move forward politically. It still needs to be addressed. It still needs us it needs to create the will to do whatever we need to do to address, as the issue becomes clear, the challenges and dangers of it.
Also, it's important to see there's two levels of the debate, right? One is the resolution that's being examined by the economist, looking at particular models or how fast, or whether we have 20 years, whether we have 50 years, or whether there's, the new ice age is coming. I mean, that's a kind of within a rational sort of scientific, let's look carefully at the evidence. Then there's the larger spectrum of debate where you have a whole lot of people saying global warming is not a problem. It's just a liberal hoax. It's just an excuse, right? While, as I said, we're not taking a firm position as a think tank specifically as to which of the ameliorative efforts ought to be undertaken. But we do believe that climate change is a problem. We do believe that the ice caps are melting, that the climate is changing, that the sea level will rise, and that besides climate change, transitioning our economy away from fossil fuels into a more sustainable energy regime is going to be beneficial for the environment and our geopolitical structures in all kinds of ways. I mean, it could indeed be the catalyst for a second industrial revolution and be an extremely a huge boon to the economy. So we're interested in building political will to change our relationship, our developed world's, especially America's relationship to fossil fuels. And if we can do that, we think that all kinds of good things will happen. And so I assume that the Economist article didn't come to the conclusion that climate change is a hoax and we ought to just not worry about it. And so in that sense, that's just sort of the back and forth, which doesn't really impact our underlying issue of it's good to evolve beyond where we are.
And just to add to that picture, because I think it's exactly what Steve's saying, it's interesting to me that these two, quintessentially modernist magazines, kind of Business Week and Economist, two magazines I actually really like very much, are trying to address this issue, trying to figure out where modernism should stand on this issue, trying to kind of feel out what's the right relationship to this issue. And I think it speaks to some of the cultural dynamics that are going, in response to the hurricane last fall, in response to some of these, a lot of uproar about the issue. They're trying to figure out what position modernism should take, which all the more reason and all the more of an opportunity to start to build this kind of political will across these worldviews.
Yeah. So it is getting late, but maybe we take just two more questions.
Yes.
Yeah, Wayne. Oh, yeah, there we go.
As you guys march, hopefully successfully into this fray, just wondering about a perennial question or objection that a lot of people that are not familiar with integral theory may come up with, and that's the whole idea of hierarchophobia, particularly on the part of the postmodernists, but all of these worldviews believe theirs is the best or the only one or should be the only one. When you guys, I assume, are going to come across that at some point, whether it's explicitly or implicitly because of the theory behind this, how are you going to deal with that?
Well, first of all, we are suggesting what is, for example, one of the reasons that academic social science has a hard time dealing with issues like the evolution of consciousness is because a significant portion of their field is dominated by the postmodern ideology or postmodern agenda, which, as you said, is very sensitive to any kind of hierarchical ranking between different worldviews or different types of culture. And that's evolutionarily appropriate for them to be suspicious, because if we look at history, we can see that when evolution was first understood and realized in the 19th century, evolutionary ideas were hijacked in a sense, to justify ethnocentric notions of cultural superiority, right? That the idea that some cultures were more evolved than others was used to justify colonialism and racism and all kinds of mischief. And so in the 20th century, many progressive people thought, well, this is an abomination. We have to overcome this idea that some cultures are more evolved than others because it's a backward idea. Ironically, that was a form of cultural evolution, right? The realization that we have to have an egalitarian, pluralistic, multicultural perspective, right? So for many years, and especially even now in academia, that's still the reigning paradigm about how we can think, each culture is its own line of development and we can't make any comparisons because that would be ethnocentric. So one of the ways that this evolutionary perspective transcends this postmodern perspective without invalidating it, while we want to include the important evolutionary achievements of multiculturalism and pluralism and egalitarianism. We take those very seriously. Those are values that we hold as well. But we also understand that there's this dialectic, that the sailboat's tacking back and forth. And if you go too extreme a hierarchy, like you had in the Victorian period, the way to move forward is to move back to a flattened egalitarian system. So we're not suggesting that we go back to some kind of Victorian notions of cultural evolution. What we are suggesting is that we want to make the world a better place. If we can't say one form of culture is more inclusive or more evolved or has a better understanding of reality than another, our ability to recognize comparative excellence and our ability to make things better will significantly be diminished. So this is one of the ways that integral philosophy is sort of it overcomes the academic handcuffs that can't see the evolution of consciousness for ideological reasons. And we begin to recognize that the directions of evolution that give us a valid way to talk about more evolved and less evolved involve a more inclusive perspective. So for example, we can see as the worldviews evolve, the value of goodness itself evolves. One way to understand that is by recognizing the scope of those worthy of moral consideration, right? In the pre-traditional kind of tribal setting, those worthy of moral consideration are your blood kin, right? And the other tribes are the enemy. Then you move to a sort of a religious worldview where those worthy of moral consideration are everybody who believes the same religion. And even though that kind of ethnocentric or religiocentric sense of morality is something we look down on today, this is a major step forward in history because it allowed multi-kinship groups to be included within the circle. Then with modernism, it moves from a sort of ethnocentric to more nationalistic, right? Those worthy of moral consideration, for example, are Americans. We don't want to send our jobs to the Chinese because Americans are more worthy of moral consideration. But that's a step forward because in America you could have, Christians and Jews and Muslims and all kinds of different religions that are still worthy in that circle. Then with postmodernism, it evolves further to a world-centric morality where all sentient beings are worthy of moral consideration. You have to be a pretty hardcore relativist to sort of deny that that is a significant evolution. We can see the same thing with truth. We move from magical to mythical to scientific rational and to increasingly holistic understandings of what's true. And these are sort of obvious ways we can describe and I believe justify our evaluation that evolution is gradually making things better despite this dialectical structure of back and forth and progress and pathology.
I guess what I'm going to say is what are you going to say to the person, a thought leader, a highly placed political leader, maybe a highly placed religious leader who has a lot of influence on traditionalism, who accuses you of being elitists because of the underlying theory. And maybe your answer is the same as for those traditionalists who are going to be so hard-headed you can't worry about them. But there may be some really major folks that will come out and say, your underlying theory is elitist, and that's what's really pushing you guys along. I think you got to have an answer for that. Particularly if it's in the public domain and it's maybe a national statement.
There will be people who say things like that. There absolutely will be. I'm sure. We may. Let's hope that we get significant enough. And let's hope that we get in a public in the public dialogue enough to be accused of things like that. That would be, in a certain way, that would be great. That would be a great sign to be able to be in the mix like that. And I think that, part of, the best response is in some ways what works ultimately. What really works. And I think what postmodernism has run into in its more, dramatically and radically egalitarianistic forms is it's not enough to have the impact they want. It's not enough to really have an impact on culture. And so they're looking for new ways. There is this desire. They're looking for new ways. And we're offering a new way that doesn't return to some of those old hierarchical systems, but has a much more sophisticated, subtle way of understanding how culture moves forward. I've noticed in some respects that postmodernism often has two ways of trying to deal with how we should relate to each other and how culture should evolve. And they're kind of at polar opposites. One is that we should recognize that we're all the same, essentially. Recognize our underlying oneness. That's really the way forward. That's the ultimate truth. That's what we need to recognize. And there's a truth in that. That's a powerful truth. The other is just the opposite, in a sense. that we should recognize our essential difference, that we have to fully recognize that we're not the same, that the true perspective and significance and acceptance of the other, that we are different, and we fully recognize and appreciate our differences. Those are kind of the two poles of postmodernism. And while acknowledging there's a great truth in each of those perspectives, we're trying to do something that really comes out in the middle and recognize some deeper truth about the evolution of consciousness and culture, which brings back this notion that no, certain forms of understanding are more inclusive than others, but it doesn't invalidate what's come before. It doesn't invalidate other cultural structures. We can appreciate this tremendous diversity of cultural structures without defaulting into an egalitarianism that only confuses and promotes a kind of a cultural denigration in some way. So we can celebrate diversity and also recognize cultural evolution, and that's really the sweet spot.
We can also point out regarding the charge of elitism that indeed our whole method is about reaching down and including that which has been left behind, and that we are trying to define a form of progressive culture that's more progressive than what passes for progressive culture today, because it better recognizes and includes these earlier levels in ways that current forms of progressive culture can't. I mean, it's also worth mentioning that every movement that we can see that has matured into a positive aspect of our society ultimately began as a kind of an avant-garde intellectual or artistic movement. And so this is the way that evolution works, and this is what we're doing, and we certainly don't feel like elitists. We certainly wouldn't want to approach things from that perspective, but not every answer can be, kind of compressed into a soundbite. It takes a little bit of answering like we've just done. All right, well, one last question then. Yes, sir, in the back. Behind you.
I'm wondering if Jesus or Buddha would have been considered the postmodernists of their time.
I would say that both Jesus and the Buddha were way beyond postmodernism, way beyond the evolutionary worldview. There's this idea of states and stages. There are stages of culture, but then there are states of consciousness that transcend the current culture. And I would say these great spiritual geniuses of the past had a level of spiritual development that, in a sense, meant they were far more evolved than the culture in which they lived, and yet that higher level of development in their own consciousness helped them be effective in reaching back down. So they were certainly using some of the evolutionary achievements, in advance of all these stages of culture and beyond, and the spiritual dimension of what we're doing is certainly in the background. It's the foundation of everything we're motivated to try to work on.
My other thought is, I wonder if biological and cultural evolution doesn't require major dislocations which don't lend themselves to compromise and dialogue. If there isn't a process of things really disintegrating.
Sure, well, the possibility of regress is a big reason why we need to be more savvy and understand evolution more thoroughly so we can prevent the possibility of regression. I mean, it's happened before. It could happen again. One of the outcomes, if the environment is it becomes as disrupted as some people predict, then that will be a triggering point that will either create a massive regression in our civilization, a new dark age, as some predict, or it could be the opportunity for us to evolve faster and in more significant ways than we could, without such a crisis. So whether it's backwards or forwards really depends on us taking responsibility for knowing that, that evolution is up to everyone. So
I would probably answer the Jesus and Buddha question differently, but I think that's a whole nother issue.
Right. So let me thank you all for coming and for your great questions, for being part of our audience. Yeah, and don't forget to surf over and check out our papers and sign our email list and tell your friends. Thanks.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Oh, good. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
I live here in Newlands.
Okay.
What's your name?
Scott Schaefer.
Okay.
Great.
And I'm actually the vice chairman of the Republican Party.